All right, while we wait to get started, I'm going to play some music.
Great.
This is this is a sarabande that Poulenc wrote in 1960. No sound? Sound? Hi, everyone. That was a sarabande for guitar that Poulenc wrote in 1960 when he was 61 years old. Okay, so um, first of all, like every time, I hope everyone is well. Tonight's salon will deal with historical and a historical event from the French Revolution. At the peak of Robespierre's reign of terror in 1794, 16 Carmelite nuns were arrested, tried, and sentenced to the guillotine as quote unquote counter revolutionaries. It is said that they were carted through the city on the 2 mile route from the prison to what is now La Place de la Concorde. And the crowd, who was usually very animated and loud during these events, was uncharacteristically quiet. On their way, the nuns bravely sang hymns as they walked to the scaffold and faced their deaths. True story. I grew up Unitarian, and Unitarians face life in a very rational way, not a lot of mysticism, no defined creed, and every church has its own philosophy, its own feel, if you will. The church I grew up in was sort of very anti-establishment. No robes, no choir, no organ. We had a piano every week in the church service, and once a month there was a cello with the piano. Um, if you look up Unitarianism online, it says that we are tasked to find our way by a quote free and responsible search for truth and meaning. For years, I went to the Church of All Souls on Lexington Avenue and 80th Street in Manhattan, primarily because the minister was Forrest Church, who was the son of the Senator Frank Church, and his upbringing had been this liberal, intellectual, political world experience, and so his sermons were always about something that really meant something to my day. And in most services, there are these words, some version of this idea, which is we come together to find meaning in a congregation. We come together to find meaning in the dual truth that we are alive and that we die. Anyway, without fail, I am moved to tears at the end of this opera every time we play it. The fact that it's a true story and that the deep and serene faith that gave these women courage, these real women, to face their deaths, believing that they were helping the world, leaves me in awe. So tonight, in addition to talking about Poulenc, the composer, and the man and his life and his times and other composers, we're going to take a little trip and explore a little bit of French history. But we're going to start with Poulenc. I'm going to show you a picture of Poulenc as a middle-aged guy. I hope everybody is well. This is such a weird time. Okay, so this is Poulenc. This is Poulenc as a middle-aged guy. Nice guy. And he was really interested in arts and literature. He was inspired by things he read. And at one point, he responded to a survey that asked him to list the 100 best books that he could recommend to other people. And he not only wrote 138 books, but he also listed like 20 books that he would be really, really ashamed to have on his shelves, like books that you really shouldn't have. He was born in 1899 and he died in 1963. So he overlaps most of our lives. He comes from, he's the quintessential 20th century French composer. He comes from a tradition of rejecting the old-fashioned romantic notions of the 19th century, bypassing the atonal and dissonant sensibilities of the expressionist, as well as rejecting the impressionist from the early 20th century. He sits firmly in a spot of creation of his own unique individual tonal language. Investigation into this opera has led me to listen to a lot of music by Poulenc. So I'm going to start today by playing a small portion of a piece that I'm working on arranging for solo viola. A byproduct of our times is that I need to find things to do and play by myself. So this is from the Intermezzo from his sonata for violin and piano from 1943. The original piece has a really lovely conversation between the piano and the violin, which I've tried to put both parts in the viola part. And what I will play for you represents only half of this movement. It's the middle movement of this 3-movement sonata. And one day I'm hoping that there will be a recital somewhere with more music. Anyway, so Intermezzo. like playing in church. There's no applause, but that's okay. Um, so let's look at the timeline of Poulenc's life. Poulenc was the younger child and the only son of a wealthy and pious Catholic French pharmaceutical manufacturer and his artistic Parisian wife. They also had a daughter who was 12 years older. Poulenc's mother sits him at the piano when he's 5 years old and teaches him the classics Mozart, Schubert, Chopin, but also what she calls adorable bad music of the day, fashionable romance music. When Poulenc is 10, 11, 12, something like that, his uncle, his mother's brother, takes him to hear Petrushka and Stravinsky's Rite of Spring. The admiration that young Poulenc has for Stravinsky at that moment will last his whole lifetime. Poulenc's father had been grooming him to take over the family business, and so young Poulenc was forbidden from enrolling in the music conservatory. This fact will cause Poulenc distress for his lifetime, that he wasn't as well trained as his contemporaries. His mother dies in 1915 when he is 16, and his father dies 2 years later, and Poulenc goes to live with his sister and her husband. I have a picture of young Poulenc. Young Poulenc. Three-piece suit, watch chain. He had money from his parents. So he was okay when he was young. He starts taking lessons from Ricardo Viñas, who's Catalan. And Viñas teaches him the music of the time. So he gets acquainted with the music of Debussy, Stravinsky, Satie, Ravel. And he introduces Poulenc in person to some of the more famous artists of his time, like Manuel de Falla and the poet Jean Cocteau, pianist named Marcel Meyer, who was a well-known French pianist, and Eric Satie. Poulenc also spends time with his childhood friend, Raymond Linostier, who is literary in the same way that Poulenc is musical, and whose parents similarly discourage her from being artistic. She in turn introduces Poulenc to Adrienne Monnier, who had a bookstore in Paris where all the great literary figures of the time would gather. Among other people Poulenc meets there is the poet Apollinaire, whose work he will later set to ballet. In fact, it seems to me that his lack of formal musical training is compensated for by the fact that he's living in Paris in the 1920s. The environment itself serves as his schooling. So I'm going to take a slight detour and just tell you some of the people, and maybe many of you will know more people who were living in Paris in the 20s. Picasso, Joyce, Hemingway, Corbusier, Stravinsky, Martineau, Prokofiev, Ravel, Gertrude Stein, Dali, Jean Cocteau, Josephine Baker, and Man Ray, to name just a few. He was living in this incredible, like, concentrated orange juice. It was like the place to be. In 1918, Poulenc serves his mandatory 3 years of military service, and he works as a typist for the French Ministry of Aviation. He uses this time to produce more compositions, setting a lot of poems to song. His interest in exotic music catches the eye of Stravinsky, who helps him get his first group of compositions published, among which is a group called Trois Mouvements Perpetuels, 3 perpetual motion movements. Remember this piece because I'm going to come back and talk about it later. In 1920, he's part of a group called Les Six: Auric, Dury, Onager, Millot, Taillefer, and Poulenc. You can look this up. They don't actually have music. They don't compose in the same way, but all 6 of them are young, modern composers who are bucking the trend and putting on concerts together. And they represent a new voice in music. They reject the notions of romanticism, and they're different from the Impressionists. They want to create a newer style of music with sarcasm and irreverence, fueled in part by jazz. Poulenc's early attempts at orchestration make him realize that he really needs some instruction, and so he takes lessons from a great pedagogue, a guy named Charles Koechlin, from 1921 to 1925. He studies not only counterpoint technique and choral writing, but also piano. And it served him well. He got really good foundations that you can see that he learned then in the rest of his music. In 1924, Sergei Diaghilev, who I neglected to mention in that list, he was the impresario and manager of the Ballet Russe. He commissions Poulenc to write a ballet. There was no plot, no story, and it sort of is just a random depiction of young people at a house party in the afternoon. It's called Les Biches, which translates not what you think. It's the does or the darlings. It premieres in Monte Carlo and it is a fantastic success and it puts Poulenc on the map. As his reputation becomes more well known, he meets more of his contemporary composers. He takes a trip to Vienna with Darius Milhaud, and they meet Berg, Schoenberg, and Webern, who really were like the biggest guys in atonal and expressionist music. 3 years later, he buys a country house, not a chateau, but more like a vintner's estate in Noisy, which is about 140 miles south of Paris. It's near Tours in the Loire Valley, despite the fact that he really doesn't like the country. So he has the garden outside his window redone so it looks just like the view from his apartment in Paris. It is, however, a place of refuge where he can be quiet and compose and be uninterrupted. And during this time, he starts to record his performances, and he will be one of the first proponents of recording music. And he continues getting commissions, which is a good thing because the work he did on the house was really expensive. I take a little aside here for a moment. Poulenc's early career is marked by what is described as hedonistic enthusiasm, which he attributes to his mother's Parisian ancestry. Poulenc himself readily acknowledges a certain split personality in himself, that of bon vivant playboy, and the other a deeply pious Catholic. I read two other descriptions that I thought were amusing. One eye of the Jesuit, one eye of the gutter, or half monk, half naughty boy. In any case, he himself was very conflicted about his sexuality. He conflated gay with impure. His personality, his psyche, his music, and sexual behavior contained contrasts and contradictions that were not alternating but simultaneous. He himself was well aware of this fact, once famously writing, "You know that I am just as sincere in my faith without any messianic screaming as I am in my Parisian sexuality." The composer Ned Rorem once observed, Poulenc was deeply devout and uncontrollably sensuous. I have a great picture. Here he is. You know, he's suave. In 1930, his friend Raymond dies. He had been considering at that moment to marry him, asking her to marry him, as she was really the only woman he knew who really understood him. Her death affected him profoundly. He really lost all sentimental interest in women and was really unable to compose for almost a year. Luckily, he continued getting commissions, and as he worked, he gained more commissions. In the early 1930s, while participating in a concert of French music in Salzburg, Poulenc meets the baritone Pierre Barnac, who suggests to Poulenc that they strike up a duo for piano and voice and take it on the road. This partnership is lucrative and lasts more than 25 years. And Barnac will be the muse and the recipient of the first performance of all future songs by Poulenc for male voice. I'm going to show you a picture of the two of them. So they really had a great partnership. They traveled a lot. They went to Egypt. They went through Europe. They went to England, and it was a great. Poulenc was a terrific pianist, and Barnac was a great singer, and it was not only a great source of income, but I think it was very satisfying artistically for them both. In 1936, two unrelated things occur simultaneous, which change Poulenc's outlook on the world. First, his friend and fellow composer Pierre-Octave Ferraud is killed. He's decapitated, actually, in a car accident. He's hit by a car in Hungary. Second, it happens just at the moment and unrelated that Poulenc was making a visit to the sanctuary of the Black Virgin in Rocamadour, which is about 375 miles south of Paris. These events together, and likely combined with Poulenc's increasing dismay at the general political climate of the time, trigger a huge religious spurt of spiritual revelation that will have a lasting effect on his music till the end of his life. You heard probably that opening guitar piece, to me sounds very religious. In this period of his life in the 1930s, he's mainly composing vocal music. Listen, I'm going to play a song now that he writes in 1934. It's a Polish song. He writes a collection of 9 Polish songs. And listen carefully. The first verse is harmonized very classically. It's very ordinary. The second verse has really uh, innovative harmonies that are still within the bounds of tonal music, but stretching the boundaries of harmony. And I think it's just a beautiful song and a beautiful way that he has of uh, of of harmony. Which I think, he it's very sensitive, very beautiful, and it's not the harmonies that you expect. In 1940, when at the eve of World War II, he's still eligible to be drafted, and the Ministry of Arts enlists him and the singer Pierre Bernac in a campaign of quote unquote musical propaganda. After the French are occupied by the Nazis, Poulenc spends most of the rest of the war in his house in Noisy, writing subversive and resistance music, ballets and songs with hidden patriotic text and melodies, which somehow the Nazi guards at the performances didn't notice. All in all, I think this was pretty brave, as he could have been a target for arrest being homosexual, and he did see his friends arrested and disappear. After the war, though, a new wave of French music viewed Poulenc as outdated, and his more serious music fell from favor. Although he was still warmly received in Britain and America, he seems to have suffered from a crisis of confidence in these years. In 1943, he writes the violin sonata, from which I played a small snippet at the beginning, and he deems it, quote unquote, a failure. In 1946, Poulenc fathers a child with a woman only known as Frédéric. Freddie, to whom Poulenc dedicates 2 works, gives birth to Marie Ange, and the child only knows Poulenc as her quote unquote godfather, and he generously provides for her in his will. Okay, 1947. We're going to have a trivia detour. In 1947, Hitchcock makes a film called Rope. Rope. The essence of the plot is that 2 men, seemingly a couple, this is 1947 after all, it's not explicit, try to commit the perfect murder. One of the 2 is a concert pianist, and repeatedly during the the film. The film is shot, it looks like it's shot in one take in one room. So it also functioned as a play. The play was written by Hume Cronin. Um, and it's not actually one take, but it looks like it. The guy sits down and he plays Poulenc's Perpetual Motion from 1918. Hitchcock, like Poulenc, was a master at weaving in hidden signs in his work. What Hitchcock was doing was Poulenc was gay, the protagonists in the movie are gay. Also, Poulenc's music refers to a perpetual motion, something that keeps going and going. And it may also refer to his long shots that Hitchcock uses in the film. Who knows? It's not a bad movie, and it's available on Amazon. Okay, back to Poulenc. In 1953, the publishing house Ricordi in Milan approaches Poulenc to write a ballet for La Scala. Poulenc is not interested, and he turns them down, but he counteroffers with an offer to do a treatment of the story of Les Dialogues de Carmélites. Poulenc had seen a stage version of the story of the nuns in Paris. He got his hands on the script and he reads it in one afternoon. He becomes obsessed. He feels that he has found the great theme of his life, uniting historical event and mystical depth. Again, he begins working like a quote unquote madman on it. He says, quote, I don't go out. I do not see anyone. I do not want to think of anything else. I am crazy about my subjects to the point of believing that I have actually known these women. He spends more time writing dialogue than he had spent on any other piece in his lifetime. He is riddled with self-doubt, thinking he's spending so much time and it's not going to be a success. And during the time that he was writing, there was also some copyright issue with the screenplay, the words from the screenplay, which took forever to resolve. And in addition, at that time, Poulenc, who might also have been a hypochondriac, thinks he's seriously ill. And his longtime companion, a guy named Lucien Roubert, was considering ending their 6-year relationship. So Poulenc goes for medical assistance for depression and insomnia, but it turns out that it's actually Lucien who's seriously ill. And he dies the day that Poulenc finishes copying out the draft of the opera. He had pleurisy. The opera premieres in Milan in Italian, in the Italian language, and it is an enormous success. For Poulenc, this is clearly a huge relief. 2 years later, he writes Gloria, a setting from the Gloria text from the Mass Ordinary. Criticisms of the piece are that some of the movements are a bit irreverent. You know, it's not stately church music. Poulenc says that he was inspired to write this music by watching a group of solemn Benedictine monks playing soccer one afternoon. Gloria is premiered by the Boston Symphony in 1961, funded by the Kusavisti Foundation. Poulenc is actually in the United States on his one and only American tour and is in the audience for the premiere. I'm going to play you a piece of it. And it goes on. It goes on. You might want to listen to it. I don't know where you listen to music, but it's a beautiful piece, and it really is very full of faith. In 1963, Poulenc has a fatal heart attack in his apartment. At his request, he has a very simple funeral. None of his music is played. The only music that's played is Bach, and he's buried with his parents. I'm going to show you a picture of him, an older picture of him. That's still a dapper guy. This is him older. You have to imagine that he dies when he's 63, so he actually looks older than he is, but still. Poulenc was sure that his legacy would be for the music he wrote later in life, the more tonal, the more religious music, rather than the spunky, cheeky, irreverent music from his early years. In a centenary tribute in the Times, Gerald Larner commented that Poulenc's predictions never came through. In 1999, Poulenc was widely celebrated for both sides of his musical character, both the fervent Catholic and the naughty boy, for both the Gloria and Les Biches, for Les Dialogues et les Mamelles de Tiresias. And Les Mamelles was another opera that he wrote that had really an absurd um, story. I'll tell you really quick. It was a man who dressed in his wife's clothing. His wife goes off to war to protest having children. Actually, it starts with her breasts floating away like balloons, and he doesn't like this, and she doesn't like the fact that what she's known for is having children. So she goes to war and she's fighting have to not have children, and he finds a way to have children. By the time she gets back, he has had 40,000 children. Uh, anyway, so Dialogue is incredibly serious, and Mamel is very absurd and funny, and he's known for both of those things. We're going to take a look at where he stands with other composers in his time, because he lives at a time again that straddles 2 centuries. Um, so um, he lives at the same time as Claude Debussy. He's very young when Claude Debussy dies. Satie is sort of a friend of his. Ravel, he has a thing where you can read about it. It's not relevant, but he has a thing about Ravel. He doesn't like Ravel's taste in music. He adores Stravinsky. Nadia Boulanger is a huge fan of his. Jean Cocteau is a absurdist poet. So he lives at this time when all these other people are living. Um, and he's affected by their music and their time, as well as, political. Um, so, what happens when a man who is sensitive, depressive, sometimes insecure, but also flamboyant and talented, with a voracious appetite for the arts, what happens when he writes an opera based on the extreme pious journey of 16 nuns of the 18th century at a time when his own country has just recovered from a period of vicious violence? Let's first just take a step back and look at the history of France. Before the French Revolution, and I didn't, we don't really learn other countries' history. So the basic thing is that in 1614 was the the previous meeting before the beginning of the French Revolution of what's called the French Estates General. The estates organized French life into 3 parts. The first estate was the church and the clergy. The second estate was the nobility. And the third estate was the 98%, 99%, whatever in those cases. The clergy owned most of the land aside from the king and generated most of its wealth by imposing taxes on those who used the church's real estate and property. By the end of the 1700s, the French demographic had radically changed, with the third estate representing 98% of the population, however, still being outvoted by the other 2 bodies, known as they had a noble veto. In any case, by like 1788 or so, there was a growing sentiment among the aristocratic estate that things had to change. So they set a meeting for May 1789 to present a list of grievances to the king. And there's no real agreement among historians about the exact causes of the revolution, but they never, that meeting started, but then like the country blew up. So these are the things that contributed. Upper class citizens, such as merchants, businesses, manufacturers, wanted to gain political power. And the lower class was aware of this and didn't want them to get more power. Ideas of social and political reform were spreading rapidly through the country as a result of King Louis XVI granting freedom of the press, which I think is pretty amazing. He granted freedom of the press. France's participation in the American Revolution nearly bankrupted their government, which also seems ridiculous. I'm sure it's true, but... And then on top of that, In 1788, there was severe crop failure on the heels of 2 decades of poor harvest, drought, and there was a cattle disease that shook the economy. This is where we got the skyrocketing bread prices. So the talks stalled and the people revolted, and the church was a target for revolutionary fervor and hysteria. Peasants just wantonly looted the homes of the tax collectors, the landlords, the elite. In a matter of months, the church's taxation rights were revoked, clerical privileges were overturned, and its property was confiscated. Many of its practices were abolished. Eventually, during the Reign of Terror, there was the establishment of a new calendar, and Christianity was abolished. Individuals involved in or practicing Christian rites were executed summarily. Churches were closed and destroyed. Religious educational institutions were shut down. Public and private worship was banned. Priests and nuns were forbidden from performing religious rites. Headed by the influential politician Maximilien Robespierre, in 10 months between 1793 and 1794, more than 17,000 people died at the drop of the blade in the guillotine. More died without a trial. Those were 17,000 were those who had a trial, some kind of trial. And more died in jail of the horrible conditions. In the last 6 weeks alone, more than 1,300 people were put to death, including these 16 nuns. There's more to it than that, but this is the basis for what happened to the nuns. And I'm going to give you a brief history of the Carmelites. The Order of the Carmelites dates back to the 1100s. This specific order is from 1641, at which point in France there were about 60 other orders of Carmelites. Carmelites are a discalced order. I didn't know what this means. It means they are either barefoot or in sandals, and they reject all worldly goods. They're very, very humble. Most of the nuns are from aristocratic families who bring with them a substantial dowry, which is the means for support of the order, but also one of the reasons they were targeted by the revolutionaries because they were aristocratic originally, and their money just came from their money. During the revolution, all the other orders were dissolved. Only this order in Compiègne, which is northeast of Paris, remained strident in their beliefs and actively opposed the Reign of Terror by practicing their religious life in secret. Carmelites believe that they can help save the world by their prayer for the rest of us. French officials at the time visited the convent and offered freedom and financial reward to those who wanted to leave the order, but none of them accepted this offer. They were thrown out of their cloister in September of 1792. They moved into the village. They sort of borrowed clothes from other people because they were forbidden from wearing their habits. And in quiet defiance, they continued to meet together and pray together secretly. Subsequently, when revolutionary officials visited them, they found a portrait of King Louis XVI and a written out prayer to the Sacred Heart of Jesus for the King. And so, along with their so-called subversive religious life, this was enough evidence to arrest them. As they were being taken away, I guess, they took a vow of martyrdom as a sacrifice to God in order to restore peace in France. They were imprisoned, tried, and condemned to death by the Revolutionary Tribunal on July 17, 1794. Even though they had been forbidden from wearing their habits, they were permitted to wash their street clothes. And the only other garments they had to wear while their street clothes were drying were their habits. And by divine coincidence, on the day that they were led through the town in the death cart on their way to the guillotine, all the nuns were wearing their traditional habits. The trip from the prison to the scaffold took more than 2 hours, and the nuns sang hymns, and the crowd, which normally jeered and mocked the accused on their way to the guillotine, was eerily silent this day. They kept singing until one by one their voices dropped out, and there was only one nun left singing. So that's not fiction. That's the truth. The genesis of this opera is that there was a nun who survived this tragedy. She'd been called away to minister, to take care of her family just at this moment, and she was not at the convent when the nuns were arrested and taken away, and she returned to Paris after it was too late. She wrote a memoir which was published posthumously in 1836. Let me also just say, let me back up 1 second, that 10 days after these nuns were put to death, Robespierre himself was found guilty of crimes against the, the, the government, and he was put to death as well. And many historians believe that it was seeing these nuns that made the people realize their own barbarity and made them wake up to the insane behavior that had been going on. So this nun writes a memoir, which in 1931, a baroness, a woman named Gertrude von Lefort, writes a treatment of called The Song of the Scaffold, which I haven't read, but apparently it's required reading when you're in Catholic school as a little kid. She herself had converted, she'd had a sacred moment, and it's not the word. She had found God. She inserts a fictional character in her version of this story who serves as a proxy for von Lefort herself. The character is called Blanche de la Force. Von Lefort, her name is spelled F-O-R-T. And Blanche is a vehicle for examining the relationship between deep faith and paralyzing fear. Blanche has what we would call today an anxiety disorder, and she decides that to enter the Carmelite order will be the safest place for her. The arc of the opera brings her to recognize her own strength in her own faith, because she spends much of the opera really in panic. But more on that later. Von Lefort herself was a convert to Catholicism, and in 1930s, she was becoming increasingly alarmed at the political anti-religious fascist fervor in her own country. She's German. In 1947, a French priest and a cinematographer adapt her novel for the screen, enlisting the help of a man named Georges Bernanos to write the screenplay. Bernanos was a writer. He had written 25 books. He was a well-known writer. Unfortunately, Bernanos himself at that moment was dying of cancer, and the film is never realized. But it is turned into the play that Poulenc saw. Poulenc writes the libretto himself for the opera, which is a very unusual thing. Most of the time, composers collaborate with a librettist. He does this because the text setting in terms of how the words go is so important to him in the music. He uses mostly Bernanos' only word. He discards about 2/3 of them, and this is why during the project that he's writing, there is a copyright issue, and it's prolonged. In any case, it gets resolved. And his style in this opera is conventionally tonal, so there's no really jarring music. And despite his own self-judgment about this, he is essentially in keeping with his peers of the time. At the same time, Samuel Barber writes Vanessa, that's from 1958. Martineau writes The Greek Passion from 1961. And Leonard Bernstein writes West Side Story, which is very tonal, in 1957. All three of these operas are written in a similarly lyric and melodic vein. In other words, Poulenc was not behind the trend, he was right in it. And perhaps the world had had enough of dissonance and atonality. Poulenc is first and foremost remembered as a composer of songs, so it makes sense that he spent a lot of time writing this libretto. The setting to the text is so detailed, and the music follows the speech pattern. For that reason, there are almost no arias. There are tender evocations of mood, grand declamatory scenes, and sublime settings of some of Catholicism's best-known hymns and prayers, including the Hail Mary and the Ave Verum. His musical models for this piece are, and listen carefully, Giuseppe Verdi, Modest Mussorgsky, whose works inspire the grand historical nature of this work. He's also inspired by Claude Debussy and Claudio Monteverdi for their attention to text, and to Bach and Stravinsky for the notion of arioso monologues. The opera is written in 3 acts. Each act has 4 scenes, and there's a musical interlude between scenes. The Met production, which is on the 20th, on next Friday, it divides the opera into two parts. So, unfortunately, the final scene of the first two acts is a little obscured in the rhythm of the overall piece because the action continues after the act is done. The use of orchestra interludes allows for the full orchestra to play full force. This is a huge orchestra, triple winds. So Verdi usually only has two winds, so two flutes, two clarinets, two oboes, um, two bassoons. This has triple winds. It also has two harps, and unusually, there is also a piano in the pit. It The interludes also help the audience to shift gear from one dialogue to the next. So in the action, there's dialogue recitative. It's like there's a lot of talking, not so much singing, and then the music is in between. With a cast which is predominantly female, Poulenc was concerned with making distinctions between vocal qualities. Without being too detailed, he modeled some of the vocal characteristics of specific nuns on other opera heroines. For instance, the old prioress, who dies a wrenching death at the end of Act One. Poulenc looked to Wagner's Kundry from Parsifal, who is also a similarly tortured and conflicted character. The new prioress, Madame Lidouane, is based on Desdemona from Verdi's Otello. Her voice, a lyric soprano who requires a combination of tenderness together with power of delivery. Also interesting to note that at the very end of the opera, when all the nuns are singing Salve Regina as they go one by one to the scaffold and their voices become fewer and fewer, when Constanze is left alone and she sees Blanche in the crowd, I'll tell you about this later, and she knows that she can die with the knowledge that her friend has decided to rejoin her fellow sisters. Blanche changes and sings Veni Creator Spiritus, Come, Holy Spirit, a text usually sung during the ordination of priests and at Holy Confirmation. It is no accident that at this point, Poulenc has her sing a prayer specifically associated with the absolute dedication of one's life to God. Blanche has spent most of the opera living in fear, but in these final moments, she reaches a point of resolution, inner calm, and acceptance as she rejoins the Carmelites for eternity with God. The opera has long attracted great artists. Poulenc conceived of the role Blanche for Denise Duval, who appeared in the Paris premiere, and in 1957, Leontine Price made her operatic singing debut in the role of Madame Lidouane in the US premiere at San Francisco Opera in 1957. I already said that. The Met premiere of the opera from February of 1977 has English language translation. They sing in English. And it featured Maria Ewing as Blanche, Régine Crespin as Madame Croissy, and Shirley Verrett as Madame Lidouane. The Met production that you will see on Friday is by John Dexter from that original premiere. And we're going to take a look at the characters so we know who is who. So there's Blanche de la Force. There's Chevalier de la Force, who is her brother, Marquis de la Force, who is her father. And the opera opens with her having a serious panic attack at home. She gets to the convent, and the Mother Superior, or prioress, is called Madame de Croissy. She meets Sir Constanze, and Constanze is a very young nun who is very sure in her belief. She's full of faith and she's calm. Then there's Mère Marie, Madame Lidouane, who is the new prioress, Mère Jeanne, Sir Mathilde. There's a chaplain. There's commissioners who show up, and there's Monsieur Javilot who shows up later when they're in prison. And I'm going to read the synopsis. And I found a really nice version of the synopsis in something called American Magazine. And I will play from the recording of the Orff Radio Symphonic Orchestra in Vienna, with Bertrand de Billy conducting, Sally Matthews as Blanche, Hendrikje von Kerhove as Sister Constanze, and Deborah Pulaski as Madame de Croissy. The opera opens silently with prostrate nuns lying on the illuminated cross. And almost immediately, it moves to the library of the Marquis de la Force. We're going to take a listen to the opening. This is the overture of the opera. So it opens with a conversation between the brother and the father saying, "Where's Blanche?" And they have a conversation. We learn of his anxious daughter's resolve to enter the Carmelite. Anyway, we go to the library of the Marquis de la Force, where Blanche has been frightened by a carriage accident. There were horses that ran, and we find out that her mother gave birth to her. She was prematurely born, and her mother dies in childbirth because of exactly the same sort of incident. Her mother was in a horse-drawn carriage, and the horse is spooked, and the mother dies, and she's just a wreck. And here is the interlude that brings, so she decides to go, and this is the interlude that brings her to the convent. This is what it sounds like. What I like about this music is that in his harmonies, he foreshadows this horrible ending. And yet there's, to me, that scene, it's heralding her entrance. It's like a fanfare. In the first scene at the Carmel, Blanche asks to take the name of Sister Blanche of the Agony of Christ. And she is reproved by the old prioress because the prioress says, "Look, this is a place of prayer. This is not a place of escape. So you need to be really sure that you're here for the right reasons." And they have a discussion, and Blanche is in fact accepted by the other nuns. And this is when they'll welcome her to the cloister. Again, you hear that this is welcoming music, but there's also an undercurrent of something difficult. In the convent workroom, Blanche meets the young, guileless, but deeply perceptive and faithful Sister Constance, who startles her by saying, very matter-of-factly, that they will both die young and on the same day. Here's what it sounds like when we meet Constance.
Comme la poignée en
And it goes on like that. Act 1's final scene in the infirmary is harrowing. Madame de Coissy is in agony, both physical and spiritual. She's dying. Mother Marie urges her to turn her thoughts to God. Madame de Coissy replies, God has become shadowed. Counseled by her kind daughter to consider God, the prioress fairly barks, why should I consider God? He should consider me. Her final humiliation is to be seen in such ultimate distress by Blanche, who is called to her bedside. And then the moment of death itself comes violently. The act's final scene in the infirmary is harrowing. Madame de Coissy is in agony, both spiritually and physically. In her death throes, Madame de Coissy has had a vision of the destruction of the Carmel, and the next two acts move solemnly, inexorably towards that horror. And I've heard many, many singers sing this. And this is Deborah Pulaski. You will hear Carita Matula, who is a fantastic actress. So hang on. This is the moment. Poulenc instructs the singer to act, to speak. In Act 2, as the nuns mourn Madame de Coissy, Costanza suggests to Blanche that we do not die for ourselves alone, but we die for each other. Or maybe even instead of each other, who knows? She wonders if maybe God makes mistakes in handing out deaths. And maybe Madame de Coissy has had this difficult death that she had to prevent someone else from having such a difficult death. And this foreshadows the fact that Blanche will be able to walk to the guillotine. Madame Lidouin is appointed the new prioress. I'm going to go fast now because it's late. She's appointed the new prioress. Blanche's brother comes to visit and tries to convince Blanche to flee with him and with their father to go to leave the country. At the end of Act 2, two commissioners enter and tell the sisters they have been expelled from the convent. One of them, kindly speaking to Mother Marie, adds that he will do what he can to help them get away safely. In Act 3, with Madame Lidouin absent, so Madame Lidouin takes the place of the sister who was not there, although she comes back. Mother Marie suggests to her sisters that they take a vow of martyrdom for the sake of France. And even though the vote for vow fails, Blanche abandons the convent. Madame Lidouin returns, and with the nuns arrested, is sent to the conciergerie prison. And she joins them in the vow for martyrdom. In the city, Mother Marie longs to join them as well, but is advised by their chaplain, now in hiding, that it is God who decides who will be a martyr. The Met's production of Dialogue is spare. It hardly has any scenery, and it mirrors the simplicity of the music. It draws the listener's attention to the inner psychology of the work. As Blanche, Isabel Leonard's clear voice portrays her struggle with fear and faith in a believable way. Carita Matula gives a stunning rendition of Mother Superior, whose job it is to set an example of pure faith, and yet, in a human way, at the end she fails. Be prepared for the final scene with a box of tissues. And that's all I got. Questions?
Thank you.
Yeah, everybody, you're going to have to turn on a second. You're gonna have to turn on your own sound. I can't affect your sound. I'd love to hear you guys.
It's absolutely fantastic. I loved every moment of it. My video is failing as
Jane?
Jane. Yes, wonderful to hear
Oh,
you.
honey.
And I've enjoyed every moment of it. And it's superb and I want to watch it and I will be there.
Yes, watch it. But it's really heart-wrenching.
I'm in the mood for that right now.
Yeah, I'm going to warn you. They have an amazing sound effect at the end.
The
And the
music.
music, I don't want to play it for you because you should hear it. But the music, Poulenc has the music as they're walking. It has abrupt stops. And in that stop, the Met puts a sound effect, which I believe is a paper cutter. I
The
believe
whole
they use
idea of the Salve Regina being cut, each voice, and the continuing Save the Queen is extraordinary. And that level of dedication and determination is heart-rending.